Hello, and welcome to our webinar on Sufficient Exemplar Training. I'm Amy Cook, BCBA and Community Manager from Rasmus, and I want to go over a few things before we get started. First, you will all be eligible to earn one free CEU if you're watching this live and complete a few requirements. We will share 3 keywords throughout the webinar that you need to write down. After the webinar, I will share an online form to complete, and you will type in the 3 keywords to confirm your participation. A recording will be sent out to all registrants. However, only live participants are eligible to earn the CEU. The first keyword is continuous, and I'll also type that in a chat in a minute. Before I hand it over to our fabulous guest speakers, I want to share a little more about Rasmus. Rasmus is an ABA clinical software company that was inspired by our founder's son, Rasmus, who was diagnosed with autism early on in his life. Our goal is to help deliver the highest quality behavioral therapy services to 1 million children with autism by helping the people who help them: behavior analysts, techs, teachers, parents, clinical directors, and all of you. We provide the best clinical platform so you can keep the focus on the child in front of you. And with that said, I'll now let Dr. Elsky and Dr. Aragon introduce themselves and get us started. So thank you all so much for being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy. I am Michael Aragon. I'm the Director of Research and Training with Behavioral Learning Network. Very excited to be speaking to you all. And I have with me here Dr. Greg Elsky, who is our CEO. He's going to be speaking on the topic as well. I'm going to be opening things up and get us started with some concepts. And Dr. Elsky is going to help and speak about some research that he helped conduct related to the topic. So thank you very much again to Rasmus for having us here as guests and giving us the opportunity to speak about generative responding and sufficient exemplar training. I want to kind of highlight some of the things we're going to go over. So the strengths to sufficient exemplar training, what it is, when to use it. We're going to explain how to implement the strategy itself, point at some areas for future research on the topic. And I'm really excited to show you a module that the geniuses at Rasmus helped create that makes implementing this procedure very, very, very simple and straightforward. I want to get us on the same page regarding some relevant terms and concepts before we dive into what SET looks like. And real big shout out to Dr. Francesca Deglia Espinosa, who's not here, but she has been providing Behavioral Learning Network with consultation for a really good while now. We love inviting experts in the field to help us improve our practice, and she's done a real tremendous job at helping us think critically about curriculum design and how to help the individuals we serve to truly master skills in a way that's going to result in lifelong learning rather than just limiting their learning to the things that we present to them within our sessions. So as we begin with this discussion, I want us to get into some terms regarding skills that are relevant to sufficient exemplar training. And we're going to start with generative language. This is really our big focus for today. Whenever novel verbal behavior, that's to say, verbal behavior that's never been heard or said before. Whenever novel verbal behavior is produced or understood, we're talking about generative language. There are absolutely many different types of generative language that fall under this category. A thorough review of each one of those types is a bit beyond the scope of today's presentation. So for our purposes, when we reference generative language, generative responding, we're talking about the accurate production or responses to novel verbal behavior. Okay. Think about behavior like imitation, behavior like matching. Once you've learned that imitation means copy model, you could pretty much imitate anything as long as you have the physical capabilities to do so, right? We're always behaving within the parameters of our biology. Once you've learned that matching means put same with same, you can really match anything, even made up symbols. It doesn't matter if you've never seen it before. You don't need any additional teaching to put two things that look similar together. And I guarantee that you'll have some pretty robust repertoires when it comes to these skills, like imitation. So let's go ahead and verify that really quick. And I'm going to be looking at the chat. I want to encourage you all to participate when I ask you to by typing in the chat. Okay. So we got a word here, Fandarima. I can't see you all. You're just names in the chat for right now. So I'm going to assume that you're all going to follow my instructions and say Fandarima for me. Okay. Were you able to echo Fandarima the same way that I said it? Type a 1 in the chat if you did, a 0 for no, or you could say yes or no, whatever's easier. Lots of ones, lots of ones. Yeah, that's what I expected. Okay, awesome, cool. Now, stop typing in the chat. Different question. Has anyone here ever heard this word before? 1 for yes, 0 for no. Have you ever heard the word Fandarima? Lots of zeros. I'm not seeing any ones. Good, awesome. If you typed a 1, I would assume you either misunderstood my instruction or you're trolling me a little bit because this word doesn't exist. It's nonsense, right? You can Google it, and Google's not going to give you anything back. This word should have been novel to all of you, right? Other than a few strange individuals that maybe look up nonsense words or come up with nonsense words on their free time. Yet many, if not all of you, were able to accurately reproduce the word, although it was completely novel to you. And that's because we're looking at an example of generative language here. Once you've learned to imitate and produce sounds for a given language, you should be able to produce novel combinations of those sounds with little to no difficulty, really. So how do we get to the point of generating language like this? Well, by teaching many unique responses within a response class, within any given domain of a generative skill. Okay? Eventually, we start responding to skills under generative language umbrella on our first try without any prompting. So let's illustrate what that process, what that journey might look like. Let's continue considering imitation for a second, this time motor imitation. Okay. You have an early learner and you want to teach them to imitate some actions. So you pick a couple of simple ones like clap and jump and wave, and you're using your physical guidance as prompts. You're providing a rich history reinforcement for moving in the same ways that you move. And after your learner meets the mastery criteria for 3, 4, 5, 6 targets, you're ready to move on and teach the next one. Let's say our next target's going to be stomping. You start with a probe just to verify this is something you need to teach. So you model stomping, and without any prompts, without a history reinforcement for imitating stomping, your learner starts to imitate stomping in the same way that you all were able to just repeat my nonsense word without any additional history reinforcement or no prompts for doing so. Okay, now we're starting to see some evidence that this learner is getting the picture of what it means to imitate. Okay. You engage in an action, and without any help, they engage in the same action. Okay. You continue testing just to make sure they're really understanding the relation here. Okay. You raise your arms, and they do it. They raise their arms. You touch your head, and they do it. They touch their head, and so on. This is what we're looking for. Okay. No additional help, new targets, things they haven't been shown before or asked to do before, and they're doing it right on their first try. Okay. We're less concerned with establishing specific exemplars, a certain number of targets for mastery. We're more concerned with establishing a general relation between my behavior and your behavior, teacher's behavior, learner's behavior. Okay? In the case of imitation, we're establishing a relation between my motor movements and your motor movements. They need to look the same as one another. Now, imagine if you had to teach your clients to imitate every motor movement important in their life. or to echo every possible sound combination. We'd be setting a pretty unrealistic expectation as instructors. There would be way too much to teach. When we look at generative behavior, our goal should be to teach until the learner indicates to us that they've learned the relation, and we obtain evidence of that when they start to demonstrate that first trial performance. And that is, they respond correctly to novel targets on their first try with no help. I'd like to also draw a distinction between generative behavior and what we're going to call cumulative skill repertoires, in which you always need at least one prompted trial to acquire novel targets. Another question for you all. Would you say you're pretty good at tacting? Would you say you all have a pretty robust tacting repertoire? 1 for yes, 0 for no. Right? We got a lot of you confident in your tacting ability is awesome. I would expect no less from a group of competent adults. So, with that in mind, what's this? Give you a few seconds. Tell me the name of this thing. Anil? Question mark. All right, I've given you enough time. I've given you more time than we would probably give the kids that we work with to respond. This is a hellbender. Okay, and it's kind of funny looking, right? It's a large aquatic salamander. Apparently, it's native to the east coast of the U.S. It has a funny nickname. They call it the snot otter. I don't know if there's anybody on the East Coast who's familiar with snot otters. I've never seen one before, but I want to point something out. You all consider yourself pretty good at tacting. Nobody said they weren't great at tacting. Nobody said they didn't have a robust tacting repertoire. And I never doubted that you didn't. And yet you still needed some prompting to get this right. You got close. Some of you said eel, some of you said salamander, but that's not the exact name of what this thing is. It's a hellbender. Okay. There are some skills where it doesn't matter how good you are at it, doesn't matter how many different targets you've learned or how robust your repertoire is, you're going to need some help when it comes to acquiring new targets. Think about learning another language as another example. So if we can't expect first trial performance on some of these skills, then what can we use as a metric to determine if our learners are becoming masters of this skill? Acquisition speed, that's the goal, that's the key, that's what we want here. Okay. How long does it take you to acquire new targets? A novice at any skill could take multiple trials, 10 plus even. I'm sure you've seen quite a range of learning curves with all the individuals that you serve. When our clients are working with a new skill, it's going to take them a few trials, maybe even a few sessions before they master a target. But the more experienced they become with a given skill, the faster they become at acquiring new targets. Maybe now they're getting it in 3 or fewer trials even. Okay. Now that's demonstrating to me that you're set up for lifelong learning. I might not be able to teach you to tact hundreds, maybe even thousands of things that you're going to encounter in your life that are important in your life, but I can rest pretty easy knowing that when you do need to learn a new tact, you're going to do so quickly. You're going to do so easily. Okay. So one more time, what is it? What's this thing called? All right, hellbender, hellbender, hellbender. Nice, there we go. A girl's hellbender. Yeah, it does look pretty funky. Note that it only took one teaching trial for some of you to still remember what this thing is called. And that's because you're efficient tactors, right? I don't need to sit here and tell you it's a hellbender 10 times before you're able to, on your own, repeat it back to me when I show you an image of a hellbender. You might not be able to tact everything in the world, but that's okay because it doesn't take you long to learn new tasks. And that's the goal, because when a learner leaves my hands and are in the hands of the world and their caregivers and the teachers, they're going to find in their natural learning environments, I can rest easy knowing that they're going to be able to learn from them quickly and efficiently, as we would expect from most individuals. Okay. So to sum things up here, generative responding is when we learn the relationship between the behaviors of others and our behavior through direct teaching, multiple responses within a given class or domain of skills. Eventually, we can use the relationship that we learn to respond accurately to novel targets on our first try. That's what we look for when it comes to mastery, first trial performance. For cumulative skills, you can never get rid of direct teaching when it comes to acquiring novel targets. You're always going to need at least a little bit of help, at least one trial of help. Okay. And so when it comes to mastery, what I'm looking for instead of first trial performance is efficient learning. You may not be able to get it on your first try, but maybe on your second, maybe on your third, maybe on your fourth, and that's still good, fast learning, and that's awesome, and that's what I want to see. Okay. This has really changed the way that we consider mastery and even write our goals for the individuals that we serve. Whereas instead of just setting a certain criteria of like number of targets to acquire, 15 imitation targets, that'll be more of a secondary goal. The primary goal is really either of these criteria I just discussed. If I'm looking at a generative skill, I want to teach you until I see that first trial performance. If we're looking at a cumulative skill, I want to teach you until I start seeing efficient learning. It's not taking many trials for you to acquire new targets. That's not to say that the number goes away completely as a goal. We still keep those as a secondary goal, and I recommend that because it's good to have a ceiling. It's good to have a cap, right? Because we don't want to be teaching these skills indefinitely. There are learners that have various learning struggles, and some may always take a few trials to learn a skill that would be considered in the generative language umbrella. So consider that fact as well, that it's good to have a logical endpoint. And that logical endpoint is really going to depend on the person's age and what our developmental norms as well as our assessment tools indicate is appropriate or is typical for an individual at that age, in terms of how many targets they have or how many skills they have for in a given repertoire. Okay. I think what is tough for individuals when they're learning these distinctions is to be able to accurately categorize what skill falls under each of these cumulative or generative skill repertoires. So we're going to play a little game to kind of help with identifying that. Okay. I'm going to present to you a name of a skill in this orange shape here. And I want you to type in the chat if you think it is a generative skill or a cumulative one. Okay, you're going to type 1 for generative and 2 for cumulative. So tacting common items is your skill. What do we think? Generative or cumulative? All right. Lots of twos, lots of twos. We got some quick learners. Awesome, awesome, awesome. So tacting common items, we're looking at it as a cumulative skill. You need some reinforcement history for saying a specific word when presented with some corresponding item, similar to kind of what you all did with the hellbender, right? You have a lot of other tacks in your repertoire, yet a novel presented item, you still need some help, some history. Now, some of you are saying both, and I can see where you're getting both. I think you might be thinking of potentially a transfer from practicing the skill receptively, if you are maybe simultaneously echoing the name of the item while it's being asked to you. Absolutely. So here we will assume if that repertoire doesn't exist and you are simply just being presented this item for the first time ever, you never had to respond to it in another way, you're going to need some history reinforcement and some prompting to get the name right. So I appreciate you all kind of bringing up that it could be both. So yeah, under that specific condition, absolutely. Now, what about object imitation? Generative or cumulative? One for generative, two for cumulative. Seeing lots of ones. Good. I love how many people are typing in the chat. Appreciate your participation. Good. Yes, 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 yes. We are looking at a generative skill, right? The relation, copy movement, right? You see an action, you engage in the same action. What about oral motor imitation? Generative or cumulative? Good. Yep. Generative, lots of ones. Okay. Another copy movement relation. Play scenario imitation. What are we looking at here? More ones, more ones. Good, good, good. Yes. Generative, another copy movement relation. Receptive instructions without objects. Cumulative or generative? Right. I'm seeing the chat shift from ones to twos. Good. So with receptive instructions without objects, there needs to be some history of engaging in an action when presented with some corresponding instruction. Okay, so even though you may know what it means to sit down after some prompting, or to stand up, or to clap your hands when given those instructions, that may not necessarily facilitate you knowing what to do when I say jump. There has to be some history of prompting and reinforcement for jumping, given the word jump. Okay, we're not looking at imitation anymore. We're looking at instruction following. What about identical matching? Generative or cumulative? Swapping back to mostly ones in the chat now. Yes. We're looking at a generative skill here, the relation being put with same. It doesn't really matter what I show you, so long as you can find the comparison stimulus in an array that matches the sample that I gave you, you're going to be able to match accurately without any additional reinforcement history for that given target. Okay. Good. What about receptive prepositions? What do we think? Generative or cumulative? Seeing some twos roll in. Good, good, good. Yes, I would agree with the all cumulative, right? There needs to be some history of reinforcement for selecting the location of an item when presented a preposition. Okay? Just because I teach you what it looks like when something is behind or next to, that doesn't mean you automatically know what it means when I say to look for the item that's under. Okay? There needs to be some teaching to occur first. What about single word quotes? Generative or cumulative? Good. Lots of ones. Yes. Okay. Generative skill here. The relation being copy vocalization. Awesome. Selecting common items. Generative or cumulative? Two, 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 two. Lots of twos. Good. I think we're starting to get the picture. There needs to be some history of reinforcement for selecting some item when given its name. Okay, very similar to the tacting repertoire. Okay, what about personal pronouns? Good. Cumulative skill repertoire. Yep. Just because I teach you his doesn't mean you know hers automatically, right? You're going to need some additional instruction for that. So it looks like we're starting to get a pretty good handle on these different skill types. Okay. A way that I like to think about these, because as adults who are teaching a lot of individuals with language deficits, we have pretty robust repertoires when it comes to these early basic language skills. So I always try to ask myself, if somebody were to present me with a task, a novel instruction, a novel item, a novel picture, a novel word, would I be able to respond on my first try accurately? Right? If somebody showed me an action, somebody who didn't speak the same language as me showed me an action and expected me to copy them, would I be able to copy them without any additional help? I kind of put myself in that scenario. And if I think I could do it without any help, I'm probably looking at a generative skill. Whereas if I think they need to give me some help, some prompt for me to answer correctly, we're looking at a cumulative skill. And I want to point out something that I think you all are realizing as you were responding with these questions, because I saw some of you saying one and then two, or more. This seems more generative than cumulative, or more cumulative than generative. I think what you all are realizing, which is really important, is really how essential it is for us to think about our curriculum design. Right? Because if we are ordering the manner in which we're teaching skills such that one certain skill can facilitate kind of the emergence of another skill, as we may see in teaching a tact, could lead to the emergence of selecting that same item in an array, even though I have no history reinforcement for selecting. Even though we're categorizing selection skills here as cumulative, we can see these transfers. We have some evidence for demonstrating that teaching a certain target in a certain way can lead to free learning when probing that same target, but under a different skill domain. So we're looking at curriculum design, which I would love to go into more depth, but we're limited on our time to do that. But I do appreciate that, because that's really how what this whole conversation was leading to in our collaboration that I referenced earlier with Dr. Spinoza, is thinking about these skills in terms of what does mastery actually look like for them, so that we can program in a way that leads to as much free learning as possible. Because we want to be efficient with our teaching. Time is very valuable. So that brings us back to our topic today, right? As efficient teaching. So let's kind of speak a little bit more to what it means or what it looks like to teach these skills. Okay. So many of the skill assessment tools we use indicate a number of targets for a given skill that individuals at a certain age typically have in their repertoire, right? So a common teaching strategy is to teach sets of targets until our learner accumulates the number of targets indicated by that assessment. Kind of calls back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of how we write our goals, right? And having a number cap. For example, we may teach imitation of 9 total actions with objects before moving on to gross motor actions, and then 15 total gross motor actions before moving on to fine motor actions, and so on until we teach all the essential imitation skills. Okay. A common strategy used to teach targets in this manner is multiple exemplar training. A set of stimuli are taught concurrently, and after a target number of stimuli are acquired, we test for generalization across untrained exemplars. For example, I may teach sets of 3 gross motor imitation targets at a time until our learner masters 15 total gross imitation targets. And then we test to see if the learner can imitate a set of novel gross motor actions. And if they can, great, we may be done with this skill and move on to the next one. Otherwise, we'll teach an additional set of imitation skills. With this approach, you can't really identify when generative responding starts to occur. It may have been after learning 5 targets, or after 10, or after 7, meaning that we may end up teaching more targets than is necessary for the learner to actually acquire the skill, right? So again, moving our focus away from just teaching a bunch of targets to actually teaching the skill, teaching the relation in the case of generative skills. Right? That's our goal, to teach the skill, not just a bunch of targets. Okay? We need to be mindful about inefficiencies in our teaching strategies as well, because time is very often not in our favor in these services. Additionally, in addition to like the inefficiencies with this approach, MET doesn't really parallel typical language acquisition, where caregivers, for example, teach specific targets when they're contextually relevant. If they notice their child can't produce the response on their own, if they're noticing their child is producing responses on their own, then they just kind of leave them to it, right? Sufficient exemplar training is an approach that addresses these limitations. It involves teaching one target at a time, probing for generative responding after each acquired target, and only teaching additional targets if generative responding isn't occurring. Okay, we're shifting our focus away from teaching set numbers of targets to really teaching that skill, looking for that type of responding that indicates to us mastery, that they get the concept, that response requirement is clear to them. Okay. We have a few papers that lend support to the efficacy of sufficient exemplar training, one of which our very own Dr. Elsky participated in producing. So I am going to hand the virtual floor over to him so he can elaborate on that study and explain more about SET and the process, what it looks like in detail. Before we get into that, though, I got your second keyword, so you can get your CUs. That second keyword is skill. Okay. Second keyword is skill. It is in the chat if you need to reference it. And with that, I hand the floor to you, Dr. Elsky.
All right. Thanks, Michael. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this study and the particulars of the sufficient exemplar training technology. Before I do that, I do want to make a couple of acknowledgements. First off, to the great Dr. Sigmund Eldevik and Dr. Eli Kazemi, who were kind enough to allow me to participate in this research and get great experience in learning about this procedure. And Dr. Eldevik has been sort of leading the charge in using this procedure and disseminating it. So if you haven't had a chance to review any of his work, and not just in sufficient exemplar training, but just generally, he does a really fabulous job, and he's really a gem to our field, as is Dr. Kazemi, of course. Okay, so before I get into that, just to continue the exercise that Michael had just done with your ones and twos, one for generative and two for cumulative. Regular past tense verbs, is that generative or cumulative? A little bit of confusion here. Interesting. Ones and twos. Okay. So regular past tense verbs, again, these are, what's the rule with regular past tense verbs? You take your verb and you add, in English, I know can be a complicated language. Yeah, regular, thanks. You add the ed to it. So you take the word clap and you add the ed, it's clapped. You take jump, add ed, it's jumped. So the answer there would be a 1. Now let's take irregular past tense verbs, right? So run, the past tense is ran. Eat, past tense is ate. Eat it, exactly, Jeff. Very good. This is what often happens with young children. Okay, so in this particular study, we examined regular past tense verbs, which is considered generative, and that's why it lent itself very well to this study. Okay. Oh, Michael, thanks. These are the participants of the study. There were 4 participants ranging in age from 6 to 20. IQ scores were missing for a couple of them, but you can generally see if you look at the adaptive behavior composite in terms of their Vineland scores, the ranges were 1 to 3 standard deviations below the mean. So these were kids that had some limitations. And you can see also that none of them had regular past tense verbs in their repertoire at the time of starting. Okay. All right, so this is what the procedure generally looked like. So we would first model the action. So in this case, I would clap and then ask the learner, what did I just do? And if they would respond correctly, they would hopefully they would say clapped, and then they would get reinforcement. That was kind of the idea here. Okay, these are the list of the regular past tense targets that you can see. We did everything: clap, jump, knock, etc. All regular past tense verbs that were easy to model. Okay, in here what you see is we love these decision trees, and so this is a general decision tree of the procedure, and we're going to go through this in more detail as we go. Okay, here are a sample of data, and I think Dr. Eldevick really came up with, I think, a really beautiful way to display these data in a way that shows generative learning, and also you can see what's happening. So on the bottom, you see here are our list of targets, our past tense verbs to be targeted. These were developed at the beginning of treatment. And I think one of the things that can be challenging in using sufficient exemplar training is you do need to have your entire list of potential targets to be taught at the outset. And all the targets need to be novel. And this can create challenges for some learners when they are not, for those that don't develop generative responding, but when they do, hopefully you don't even get to the end. Okay, so on the bottom, what you see is this is our list of targets. On the top, these are a number of trials. And then what you see in between are these little bars that indicate this is your trial by trial data, whether the learner responded correctly in gray, incorrectly in black, and then if there was a prompted response, it's these little dotted squares. Okay. Can you go back just for 1 second before we go into this? So although we do have this beautiful decision tree, when I teach this to people, I try to give it some really simple rules, and I'll get into the more specifics of it, but it's really 3 in a row, 5 in a row. So it's probe it. If they get it right, move on to the next probe. If they get it wrong, you you continue teaching till they hit 3 in a row in mass trials, and then move it into a random rotation until they get 5 in a row, and then you move on to the next target. Okay, but we'll get into that in more specifically. Okay, so in this first part, so again, you present the learner with the initial target, you probe it. If they get it right, great. You move on to the next target. If they get it wrong, then you go into your teaching, 3 in a row, 5 in a row. So as you can see here, in clap, the first target was presented. You see there was a black bar. They got it wrong. Then there was a prompt delivered. And then you see 3 in a row in gray, which means so they had 1 incorrect, 1 prompt, and then they started getting it right. And once they got 3 in a row, we moved on to jump. And you can see there, they probed on the first probe of jump. They did not get it correct. It had not produced any kind of generative responding as of 5 trials in for this particular learner. They got it wrong. You see there's some prompt fading, and they continue on up until they hit 3 in a row. Now, because they couldn't go to 5 in a row just after the first one because there was nothing to discriminate against. So they did 3 in a row, and then in the jump, again, 3 in a row. Now, once they hit that 3 in a row, wanted to make sure that the learner is able to discriminate between the first 2. So they continue teaching in that random rotation until they hit 5 in a row. And so you can see the gray squares sort of going back and forth until about trial 50. Once they hit 5 in a row, correct responding independently, then move on and introduce the next target, which was knock. And so you can see they got it incorrect on the first trial. And then again, 3 in a row, 5 in a row. And as you're going, and every time you move over to the right, you have more and more targets that you can discriminate against within that sort of random rotation. Okay, I think I'm kind of getting ahead of you, aren't I, Michael? Sorry about that. Okay, and so we continue on, can keep going up until, yeah, right there. And so this is where the beauty happens. As you can see here, right around trial, I don't know, it's about 145, you start to see the learner responding correctly to novel stimuli on the first trial. So you see they got, I think that's patted correctly. My eyes are not great. Cleaned. Michael, help me out here, would you? What's the number 9? What's that?
So the ones that they ended up mastering here, they got cleaned, called, ripped, wiped, rolled, cried. They started getting all these at the end there.
Beautiful. As you get older, and apparently I need like bifocals and I cannot even see the slides anymore, but thanks for your help. Yeah, so this is where sort of the beauty really happened, is as you can see, the learner started to acquire those skills on the first trial. And so rather than needing to go through and teaching, in sort of more traditional ABA models for teaching language, usually you have some sort of mastery criteria, and it's like 80% across a certain number of days and certain number of people and stimuli, et cetera. We got really, really efficient learning so that we were able to start seeing that the learner didn't need to be taught so systematically anymore, and they understood what really is just the rule here for regular past tense verbs, which is just add the ed. Okay. And so here you see the outcomes. And again, what's really cool here is you can see the range of day. Everybody was able to acquire the regular past tense verbs. And it took range between 1 and 4 days of teaching to do, with a range of 39 to 157 total trials. And when you compare that again to what typically more traditional ABA mastery criteria, usually this is going to take much more than 4 days. In some cases, it could take a month or more to acquire this. So it was really, really cool. Some limitations, you can see most of the learners, or at least, I'm sorry, 2 of the learners did maintain the skill after a 3-month follow-up, after teaching had been discontinued. Chris, he did pretty well, but was inconsistent. And as you can see, Roy did not maintain it at all. But in general, it's a pretty efficient procedure, and there's some things that I think can be done to, in the case of learners that are struggling with maintenance, that could help facilitate that. Okay. All right, so some takeaways. Sufficient exemplar training can facilitate generative responding for past tense verbs. It worked really fast, really efficiently. It was really cool to see. The number of targets required for generative responding to occur may vary. Some learners get things more quickly than others. I can also tell you, in using this procedure for other skills, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, there are some learners that do not get the generative responding, and you continue to have to teach trial or target by target by target. And in those cases, this procedure can get quite cumbersome, in fact, because you start to run out of novel stimuli. But that's also why when we are selecting our mastery criteria, we usually have 2 different versions of mastery. One is that they're acquiring the generative responding, or there's some sort of ceiling that's based on normal childhood development. And so there needs to be an end criteria. Otherwise, for some learners, this could go on indefinitely. The maintenance of generative responding over time is not guaranteed, so sometimes you do have to program for maintenance with this procedure. Okay. Okay, so some future research. So this is an area that is of great interest to us, because again, I think as Michael had said, time is not always on our side when we're talking about teaching individuals with autism, and particularly young learners. And so we want to be really, really efficient in the extent to which we can save time really matters. So some future research we want to look at is we want to compare the efficiency between multiple exemplar training and sufficient exemplar training. We want to have published research showing that that sufficient exemplar training goes well beyond regular past tense verbs, which, by the way, what I didn't mention was one of the things that we had done at the end of this study was we probed for some of the irregular past tense verbs. And the learners, when we said run, for example, they would say runned. So it sort of overgeneralized to that, but that is also kind of normal for the English language, which is a lot of funny rules as some of us know. Okay. Then the last thing is evaluating the efficacy of technology, which we're going to talk about. So teaching the skill, teaching sufficient exemplar training to behavior technicians, it's not that difficult to do, but if you look back at the data that we were presenting earlier, you can see that there were some errors in terms of practice, where the techs would they would go in random rotation too long, or they may forget certain things. And so our friends over here at Rasmus, and I do want to take a moment to shout out Nikolai and Rachel, who and all of the team at Rasmus. They really do a fantastic job. And in our opinion, we use a lot of different technologies, and Rasmus is for sure our favorite. They're not paying me to say this. It just really is a great product. And Nikolai and Rachel are kind enough to humor me periodically when I have wish list items and I say, wouldn't it be great if it would do this? And then a month later they provide some sort of a product. And in this case, it was Sufficient Exemplar Training. They did create this module for it that makes using this procedure really, really easy. And so with that being said, I'm going to pass this back to Michael and he's going to demonstrate that.
Yeah, I'm curious. So tell me in the chat if you feel confident or if you remember the criteria for mass trialing a target versus random rotation versus knowing that we hit mastery criteria. For how many of you is that clear at this point? 1 for yes, 0 for no. Not yet. 1 for yes, 0, 1. Okay. Then you got a little bit of shy on this one. Okay, some is clear, some not so much. Okay, it's a lot to keep track of, right? And like Dr. Elsky mentioned, there were some integrity errors in text, kind of presenting the right number of trials for a given target at certain phases. So Rasmus has done a lot of that thinking for us and built something really cool that I want to show you all. And some of you may have already seen this in programming on Rasmus if you're using it. When you select a program type, at the very bottom, there's one that says Sufficient Exemplar Training. And I'm not sure that many people are using this, maybe not super aware of this procedure as a whole, which is a big reason why we wanted to have this webinar. So we're going to show you how to use this program function now. Okay, so you pick the skill that you want to use Sufficient Exemplar Training for, set your program to that mode. And then in terms of the program setup, all you really need to do is enter your list of targets. That's really the majority of the setup, is write down your list of targets. What you do is set the first target to baseline and everything else to weighting, and you're done. Your program is set up for Sufficient Exemplar Training. Okay? Rasmus has a algorithm that will automatically open targets per the criteria that Dr. Elsky just went through in that paper. Okay, so let's look at how that works. Okay, so on the left here, you'll see a Rasmus session as if it were ongoing, and we're going to be collecting data in the way that we would if we were conducting Sufficient Exemplar Training. And on the right, I have our schematic that outlines the different criteria for all the phases involved in Sufficient Exemplar Training, whether we're teaching a target in mass trials, randomly rotating them, or moving toward mastering the skill. So here we are probing our initial skill ring on a stacker. We got an incorrect response, so that puts it into teaching, okay, into mass trials. And so we are going to continue on with prompting after an incorrect response, and after every correct response, whether it's prompted or unprompted, we're going to probe again to see if the individual can do it by themselves. Okay. So we keep going with our prompting when an error occurs, and then an independent opportunity to respond after they get a correct response. And we're just going to continue on with this process until finally we get some independent responding. Okay. We have to get 3 in a row before we can say we're done teaching this skill. We got 2, and now we have 3. And you'll see now it moves on to probing the next target in our list. Okay. So we probe the second target, shape in sorter. It's correct, but it's not the 5th consecutive correct novel target. So we continue probing the next one, okay? And it's incorrect. So you'll see that incorrect responding to the 3rd target we introduce to its probe, we teach it in the same way we had to teach the 1st target. Okay? And after the learner responds independently to this target per the mass trial criteria, it then throws us into random rotation, right? Because now we have at least 2 targets that met that mastery criteria of 3 independent responding. So it rotates everything that has met that criteria so far. Whenever you see currently in generalization on high Rasmus, that means it's in random rotation, okay? So an incorrect response now in random rotation. What happens? Well, brings it back into teaching. And now we got to meet that 3 in a row independent correct criteria again before the target is then placed back into random rotation with everything else that has been correct. So Rasmus is keeping track of what has met that 3 in a row criteria. What have we responded incorrectly to? Let's reteach it. Okay. It doesn't matter if it's an initial probe for a given target or if it's in random rotation. If incorrect responding happens, it will send us into teaching. Okay. And once we hit that random rotation criteria for correct responding, we keep probing novel targets. Okay. Rasmus is going to continue cycling through these phases per the criteria that we described until the learner responds correctly to 5 novel targets consecutively, at which point the program is going to be marked as mastered. So we had to do some teaching for our first target. We had to do some teaching for our third target. That was randomly rotated with the first 3 targets. And then targets 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, that's when the learner started to understand the relation and start getting first trial performance, okay? At the end, Rasmus does a really nice job of depicting these data, very similar to the graph that you saw in Dr. Elske's paper, only that the trials are going horizontally rather than vertically. That's really the only difference. Does a nice job at color coding as well if you assign colors to your different prompts or your different response types. It's really awesome for doing some data analysis after the fact. And here is a pretty clear demonstration of the rules that we explained being followed. So don't worry if it was a little bit hard to follow what the rules for each phase was. Rasmus does all that thinking for you. And I saw someone ask to see what the initial program setup looked like. So really quickly, I could run back to that since it's very, very easy. When you create a program, at the very top, let me highlight it here with the pointer. It's kind of light gray. It's hard to see even in the website itself, but you hit this little arrow, this drop down, and that's where you can choose whether this is skill acquisition, which is pretty typical for most DTT and ET programs, recording frequency and so on, but we're looking for a sufficient exemplar training. You can add whatever program instructions you want for your tech, but again, Rasmus does most of the work for you when it comes to the procedure. Really what you need to worry about after that is just putting in a target list, setting the first one to baseline, the rest to waiting, and everything I just showed you occurs automatically thereafter. Your tech just needs to focus on pushing one button at a time and presenting the right SD. Okay. So I hope that this becomes something that you all use in your practice and something that we'll definitely be using and hopefully evaluating in some research projects as well to demonstrate some efficacy to using this and seeing if we can get less integrity errors when we go about it this way. Alma, you're asking if the criteria can be customized. At this point, they can't, but I'm sure that's not something that Rasmus couldn't help us out with and creating some specific customization. It works very similar to how if you all use the skill-based treatment module that Rasmus also has, where the criteria are kind of set in stone as well for that. It works very similar to that way, but I'm sure in the future there may be some opportunities to customize those different criteria. And to be clear, these criteria are based off of the paper that Dr. Elsky went off of. As you noticed, that there still needs to be a lot of kind of research done in this area and on this process. So these criteria are sort of preliminary as to what we've seen as efficacious so far and are definitely subject to being improved in the future if we see more efficient ways of moving on through these phases. Okay. So Thank you very much for listening to our talk on sufficient exemplar training. If you want to reach out about this procedure, how to set up programs, talk about generative, cumulative responding, curriculum design, stuff like that, very happy to nerd out with all of you. Here's our contact info. So now I think we have a bit of time to open things up to questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Aragon and Dr. Elsky. That was fantastic. We do have some time for questions. So if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A. And if you don't mind also stopping your screen share so I can pull up my screen.
There you go.
Okay, and it does look like we have one question. Can we probe more than one at a time? For example, I let them tact 3 at a time. And when it's done, jump to 456. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that would probably not be consistent with sufficient exemplar training. That would be more consistent with multiple exemplar training. So in sufficient exemplar training, it is done really systematically and one at a time.
Okay, and then it does look like there's also a question in the Q&A. I thought I saw one. As I screen shared, I just kind of lost it. I don't know, Erin, if you can turn your audio on. Can you view the?
They were asking for a copy of the slides.
Okay. We will send a recording out to everyone. I don't know about the slides. That would be up to our Dr. Elsky and Dr. Aragon if you'd want to share those slides or not.
Yeah, we can make
Yeah.
a PDF available.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, the last keyword is growth. If you want to learn more, you can check out our websites and book a demo to see how the platform can help you. You can also connect with us on social media to stay up to date with our latest webinars and free resources. And please also don't forget to complete the form in the chat to earn your CEU. And I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you so much for learning and growing with us.